Okay, Pallavi, do you want me to start recording now?
Sure, yeah, that'll be great.
Okay.
I'm starting the webinar now, Kurt, and probably a couple of minutes before everybody joins. Welcome, everyone. My name is Pallavi Swaranjali. It is February the 5th, 2022, and today is our concluding webinar of the series Mindful Modernisms. Today's webinar is titled The New Intimacy, Liminal Spaces of Generosity, Interiors and Interiority, featuring our two very distinguished speakers, Beate Söntgen and Katarina Bonnevier, who my colleague Kurt will introduce shortly. A warm welcome to Katarina and Beate. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Mindful Modernisms is an 8 webinar series, and it is a cross-cultural and interdisciplinary discussion organized by the Academic Initiatives Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats, Bachelor's of Interior Design program at Algonquin College, and the Department of Interior Design at the University of Manitoba. Each webinar brings together two distinguished speakers in dialogue around modern and mindful themes. These speakers come from various backgrounds, and we've had speakers who've come in from history, from architectural design and representation, gender studies, psychology, sociology, contemplative studies, art, and various others in our past 2 series. The series is supported by the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada and Interior Designers of Canada, and partially funded by the Ontario Association of Architects, and a grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. So we thank all our sponsors and, of course, our generous presenters for their time and effort in making this series happen, as well as all the students, research assistants, and volunteers who have helped us put up this series. The series is co-curated by Kurt Esperson-Peters, Roger Kona, and myself. Mindful Modernism is also part of a larger ongoing series of webinars, publications, studio and seminar courses and exhibitions, which is again organized by the Academic Initiatives Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats, Algonquin College and University of Manitoba. For more information on our project or how to get involved, you can visit our website, which is mindfulhabitats.ca. And also to watch our previous webinars, please visit and subscribe to our YouTube channel. This is also a continuing education course for the Ontario Association of Architects. So for people who are in our audience today, if you want the continuing education certificate, please send me an email. I will put in my email ID in the chat window shortly. I would now like to invite Kurt to introduce our speakers. Kurt is my colleague, great friend, and an assistant professor in the Department of Interior Design of the Faculty of Architecture at University of Manitoba. He has a BFA from the University of Victoria, MArch degrees from the University of Calgary and from McGill University. And his research examines critical design theory and pedagogy, focusing on the relationship between the built environment and human thinking and experience. He's also deeply fascinated by the arcane wisdom of the Victorian polymath, John Ruskin. Welcome, Kurt, and it's over to you now.
Thank you, Pallavi. And I'd also like to return the warm greetings from Pallavi, and it's been a pleasure working with her on this series as well. And Pallavi is a full-time faculty at the Bachelor of Interior Design program at Algonquin College. She has a BA in architecture, a Master's of Design in Industrial Design from India, and a PhD in architecture from Carleton University. And her research centers on the relationship between architecture and storytelling, looking at non-conventional modes of architectural representation that combine the normative and the fantastical, and the ways in which they meaningfully transform architectural making and experience. She is a coordinator of Carleton Research Practice of Teaching Collaborative, and one of the founding members of the Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats. So it is with a great pleasure that we introduce our final webinar for the Mindful Modernist series. And this one falls under the category of Mindful Habitats and the New Intimacy. When comprising this webinar series, we wanted to look at the relationship where and how do the mindful and the modern become a paired concept to shape a new generosity and ethics within design practice and the home. And are we aware of our assumptions, our selected bias as we design, and the role of the pre-given hidden in our own education? And what could be the new intimacy moving forward? Those were the probes that we came up with. And for this session, we actually asked both Katarina and Beate to look at the new intimacy, liminal spaces of generosity. So our session description for today is, can we shape unusual new built environments, which may or may not even be called architecture or referred to as modernism as we know it, but an evolving practice that respects both the individual and the collective, the designer and non-designer, the architect and non-architect, always in that liminal space of potential. So with this as the prompt, we asked both Beate and Katarina to do a presentation on their understanding of mindfulness, modernism, and the new intimacy. So I'd like to introduce both of our speakers before they begin their presentations. I'd like to introduce Katarina. In her practice, artist, architect, and researcher Katarina explores relations of architecture, aesthetics, and power, especially from gender perspectives, informed by theatricality, queerness, and the more than human. She is a founding member of the Art, Architecture, and Design Collective, Beate, collaborations from 2012 to the present day. Her field of practice includes building and set design, art installations, performances, workshops, lecturing, and writing. She is currently directing artistic research, Troll Perception in the Heartlands, affiliated with the Linnaeus University and founded by the Swedish Research Council, a transdisciplinary design project emerging out of southern rural Sweden, expanding the formal field used to anticipate sustainable features through site-specific crafting and animations. So please join me in welcoming Katarina to today's session. Beate is a professor of art history and was vice president of research and humanities in the presidential committee from 2012 to 2019 in Leuphana University in Lunenburg. She heads the research training group Cultures and Critique, as well as, together with Suzanne Lieb, the research program Primus, PhD in Museums. She held a professorship in art history at Ruhr-Universität Bochum from 2003 to 2011, where she co-directed the postgraduate program Art Criticism and Curatorial Knowledge, and was a Lorenz Professor for Contemporary Art at the University of Basel in Switzerland from 2002 to 2003. She is a member of the advisory board of the Text zur Kunst and of the board of trustees of the Volkswagen Foundation. And her publications include books on modern and contemporary art, art theory, and criticism. So please, everyone, join me in welcoming Beate to today's session. So today's session, we'll start off with Beate doing a short presentation on her session topic, and then we'll move over to Katarina. She will do her presentation, and then we will have a discussion afterwards. And for anybody who has questions, please drop them into the chat, and we will get to them in order of them being arrived in when we have a pause in the discussion to introduce the questions. So please feel free to contribute. So without any further ado, Beate, I'm going to turn this over to you, and you can begin the presentation.
Thank you so much. So a very warm welcome from my side too, and many thanks for this beautiful invitation. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to discuss with Katarina and learn more about her work. What I learned already is that we both love the Bloomsbury group, and today I will present their ways of living and working together as a mode of intimacy and a new unconventional form of community beyond societal norms. And I will present their ways of living and working together maybe as a model for today too. So may I first introduce the house and the Bloomsbury group to you, because I'm not quite sure whether everybody knows them. So, can you see the presentation? Okay, the full modus doesn't work, then I'm thrown out, so we have to deal with all this framework around the images. Charleston Farmhouse is an unusual home. It is a small ex-farmhouse in Sussex, southern England. It is a form of it is a materialized form of life that was peculiar in the early 20th century, when a group of artists made it their own, but still remains unusual today, Bloomsbury. This form of life offers an alternative to the norms of the Victorian bourgeois family. This new form of life emphasizes the entanglement of autonomy and community, both socially and artistically. The Bloomsbury Group the Bloomsbury Group's form of life is shaped by a number of practices which concern artists' way of working, their forms of expression, their interpersonal relationships, and their habitation of the house, particularly the house's furnishing and decoration, and the way this was done. The Charleston Farmhouse is a concise expression and framework of these practices, in that it is a product of collectivity influenced by modernist ideas of the autonomy of art and of life, as well as by forms of collaboration, entanglement, and appropriation and dedication. The group was named after the London neighborhood where the Stephen siblings began their unconventional lives. After the death of their parents, Virginia, Vanessa, Adrian, and Toby Stephen moved from middle-class Kensington to Bloomsbury, where they established an intellectually and sexually liberal circle. Rarely enough, it was the women among the siblings who would become famous, namely the writer Virginia Woolf, whom you know maybe, and the painter Vanessa Bell. The circle was comprised largely of Toby's university friends from Cambridge, including the sisters' future husbands, the politically active author Leonard Woolf and the art critic Clive Bell, as well as the writer and biographer Lytton Strachey and the economist John Maynard Keynes. The group was later joined by the art critic and curator Roger Fry and the painter Duncan Grant, who were influential for the furnishing of Charleston. Countless others were loosely associated with the group over long periods of time. The group discusses art, literature, and politics in a setting that transgressed societal conventions and Victorian norms. Women were involved to an unprecedented scale, which was intentional, if not programmatic. Also, sexuality was a central topic. The circle was very much shaped by homo and bisexual as well as polygamous relationships, today we would say queer. This led to a constantly changing configuration of friends and lovers. They documented their form of life in various ways and in different media, and they did so in an astonishing extent. The Bloomsburys collectively furnished, inhabited, and animated spaces, and they depicted these spaces and their occupants in text and images. Just to show you some examples. One of the most significant constellations for the establishment of Charleston Farmhouse was the relationship between Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant, a former lover of Maynard Keynes. A relationship that began as a love affair and ended as a long-term living and working partnership. This relation also included Duncan's lover David Garnett in a ménage à trois, as well as Clive Bell, Vanessa's husband, who himself had numerous love affairs, including a passionate flirtation with his sister-in-law, Virginia Woolf. The curator and critic Roger Fry is also significant in this context. When his wife developed an incurable psychological illness and moved to a clinic, he began an intense love affair with Vanessa, which turned into lifelong friendship as well. Fry, as a frequent resident and co-creator at Charleston and a theoretical advocate of the entanglement of life and work. Despite the importance of sexuality for Bloomsbury, both as a subject and a norm-breaking practice, sexual liberation was not, at least in my perspective, the main objective of their form of life. Rather, it was, to put it with Foucault, about reopening affective and relational virtualities and about the associated forms of artistic expression and work. They are, in a way, transverse or even queer in the social fabric. The fact that Charleston was used as the site and the expression of such transversity or queerness was unusual considering the fact that in England at that time, modernism was understood in terms of heroic masculinity, technicity, toughness, and urbanity. As Christopher Reid has pointed out, domesticity, and particularly one that was oriented towards intimacy rather than functionality, could be understood as the antithesis to modernity. So Charleston is an example of another understanding of modernity in terms of domestic intimacy and their expression. The group's relocation from Bloomsbury to Charleston in 1916 was an effect of the First World War and can be attributed to their pacifism. The men took on work as farmhands to avoid conscription. After the war, Charleston became the summer residence where the Bloomsbury group met in various constellations. These varying constellations changed the occupancy of rooms which the inhabitants had furnished and decorated for and with each other. Without going into the indeed quite beautiful details, the pictures of the rooms give a first impression of the interconnectedness of the walls, furniture, fabrics, and things, both amongst themselves and with the inhabitants who designed, produced, or painted them, either for the community or for individual members. Paintings and ornaments reminiscent of post-impressionism French painting around 1900 can be found on cupboards, tables, wall panels, and in window niches and on fabrics, many of which were collaborative designs, like some of the furniture pieces from the Omega workshops. The interior design is both a testimony to the community and a reference to art to which it should be given equal status. On the one hand, the style and iconography of the decoration reflect the designs of the egalitarian Omega workshops founded by Roger Fry, for which some of the Bloomsbury group worked, and which, like furnishing of Charleston, was inspired by post-impressionist painting. I'll show you just an example of one of the rooms of Charleston Farmhouse and images of Henri Matisse, who was very influential for the decoration of this house. On the other hand, the Bloomsburys repeated or quoted their own works or incorporated other members' particular modes of representation and integrated them into the design of the rooms as a gesture of friendship or love. This entanglement between the home and its inhabitants is reinforced by the paintings which bring the rooms of Charleston to life and fill the walls there. They depict everyday rituals in the house, portraying the Bloomsburys at work or at breakfast. Other paintings portray collaboratively realized art projects. For example, Angelica, the daughter of Vanessa and Duncan, appears in a costume for her role in Virginia Woolf's comedy Freshwater, which was only performed for a private audience. You see here Angelica in this costume. In the studios, which are also often changed its occupants, this play of quotations, dedications, and the appropriation of subjects and forms intensifies in individuals' own paintings and those they appropriated on textiles and on furniture. The Charleston Farmhouse manifests the ways in which its inhabitants lived community and at the same time continuously recreated it in acts of collaboration. From collective processes of producing and decorating the furniture, to mutual adornment and exchange of rooms, to the gifting of paintings and the reciprocal quoting of subject and modes of representation. Such acts of dedication and appropriation can be understood in the sense of Marcel Maus's gift exchange, a notion that, with its commitment to reciprocity, constitutes a binding and visible sign of belonging and community. At the same time, however, the visibility of the forms of dedication and appropriation that manifests in the home's furnishing reactivates an entanglement of the inhabitants and their working methods. It was a way of dedicating images, subjects, and styles to those with whom they shared a form of life in forms of expression. The art and process of painting served the group as a kind of gift exchange that intensified the commitments of the communal working and living situation, in that it rendered the bonding visible beyond the gift itself. It is the visual language of modern art, especially post-impressionism, that communicates this sense of communal bonding. Post-impressionism shows the interrelatedness of all elements which work towards a harmonious, autonomous whole. Modern art becomes a model of social forms of life. I can elaborate on this if this is not quite clear, but I would like to cut it short for the moment. But how can forms of life as such be understood? As Rahel Yegi has shown, forms of life always precede concrete life. They are carved out in order to be recognizable as forms of life at all. At the same time, they are only created based on specific clusters of practices whose relatedness identifies them as forms of life. So they often assume meanings that derive from their functions. Forms of life in this perspective are material and intellectual constructions that find both their expression and their regulatory frame in architecture and in houses. I think you know this better than me. The example of Charleston brings to the fore precisely such an interplay between the carved out paths of forms of life and the practices that realize them. The rooms bear witness to a practice of dedication and appropriation that transverses the patriarchal and monogamous notions of Victorian marriage and family. The future husband, for instance, needed to ensure that the Victorian house was ready for occupancy by the time of the marriage. A handbook for young men published at the time states, quote, "With care, prudence, and forethought, first prepare your home. For it's not manly to allure a girl from peace and comfort and sufficiency to a sad, cheerless heath and stinted board." In other words, the wife was expected merely to maintain a home that the husband had already furnished and decorated as testimony of his status. In contrast, Bloomsbury's art of furnishing can be understood as a collaborative community project dedicated to love and friendship. It draws inspiration from a traditional practice cultivated by the Georgians in England between the 18th and early 20th century. As Amanda Vickery points out, at that time, furnishing a home was not regarded as a task of the husband prior to the marriage, but was undertaken jointly by the couple as an expression and consolidation of the marriage covenant. The libidinal, erotic, and emotional energies that materialize in Charleston's furnishing were not directed exclusively at spouses who at that time were solely of the opposite sex, nor were they directed at random love objects in a bohemian fashion. Rather, they circulated within the group with an almost unconditional loyalty to the multiple friendships and love relationships, regardless of any implicit or explicit conflicts. On the one hand, the Bloomsburys burst open the normative and legal structure of the bourgeois nuclear family. What remained unscathed, on the other hand, were the underlying notions of morality, freedom, and autonomy, which are attributed to a modern concept of familiarity and intimacy. Yet Bloomsbury realizes and represents a form of life that deviates from Victorian norms through rituals, procedures, and technologies. The group does not simply reject the concepts that underlie these norms, but seizes upon them and situates them in a new framework. The group achieves intimacy and connectedness, which is oriented towards freedom and autonomy through various practices, through collaborative artistic projects and shared intellectual interests. They did it through mutual representation in image and text, through the appropriation and transference of representational forms and the collective furnishing of the interior. They established a demonstratively interwoven form of decoration that incorporates everyday objects and can be applied in a multitude of ways. Framed and ornamental images served as means of communication to articulate and encourage a new form of life as artistic form. The artistic form inspired the inhabitants to continuous artistic production of text and image. Charleston is a collectively furnished space, fluid in its design and use. This is the expression and the framework of a new form of life, a framework that in turn influences the inhabitants and their form of community. The extent to which even this community internalizes and reproduces governmental techniques of controlling life, body, and soul, as well as gender-determined notions of production and reproduction, be it through the work ethic in creative production, or through the juxtaposition of the intellectually productive childless Virginia and the sensual, reproductive, but less discursive Vanessa, so was the talk of the group, merits further investigation. Nonetheless, new possibilities of relationships and articulation materialize in the Charleston Farmhouse transversal to the social fabric. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beate. That was very interesting. Wonderful. Katarina, would you like to begin your presentation?
Yes, please. Oh, thank you so much, Beate. It's fantastic to look into the Charleston mansion and also the Bloomsbury group. And also I was sitting here reflecting on how much of that work that they were doing and how you interpret it really reflects upon what I'm trying to achieve in life, you know, through my practice and my way of living and so on. So it will be really fun to start discussing with you. So hi everybody, my name is Katarina Bonnevier and I'm really, really happy to be here. It's so exciting to share the world like this. Our fellow creatures all across the globe, I guess. I don't know where you're sitting, you who are watching this, but I'm happy that you are we're in this shared screen space for a little while, and perhaps we'll be in other shared spaces in the future. We'll see. I'm gonna jump into the practice that I'm involved in today, because I thought it would be really fun to have that as a kind of parallel to your presentation, Beate, with what Bloomsbury we're doing. And of course, to be able to have that discussion for the ones who are watching and listening to this, I want to give you a kind of synopsis or a little tour into the world, which I'm trying to create together with my collective. And so I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to take you on to our web page. So do you see my screen right now? No?
No.
No. Okay. So I stop sharing and I'll try again. Let's see. We tried this before to make sure that this would work. So I'm not sure why this didn't work. Okay, I'll try again. What about it?
We do see a thick white line. I don't know if that's what you're...
Thick white line. No, that's definitely not what I want. I wonder if I... okay, so stop sharing. I'm sorry about this. Let's see why this happened. Okay, let's make another try. I'll give it another try and I can switch modes. So trying to do something else if this won't work. So, but I just want to give it a try. Let's see. Yay! Oh,
Yeah, it's
okay. Okay, so just the Zoom gods are here. So thank you for that. Okay, so I'm gonna see if I can take away a little bit of everything which is around here. So do you still see my screen? And this, yeah, the movement. Okay, so I'm part of a collective called Mycket. In Swedish, that means a lot. Because everything we do, we are kind of maximalist in everything we do. We're not only designers and architects, even though, you know, traditionally that would mean that you're kind of just drawing something that someone else has built. But we're also craftspeople, so we're actually crafting with our hands, doing things. And we are very invested in the decorative as a kind of architecture. And I think that connects a lot to what I talked about with the Bloomsbury group. We are also always working with the programming of the spaces that we work on. So what kind of activities are taking place and how can the material things that we put there, how can they support the activities that takes place? And for me, the first thing that you see here on the screen is a project we did in southern Sweden. It's a dance place called the Ball Cap. And as you can see, it's an enormous ball cap. And it's a collaboration with a dance group called Mixed Dancers. And they wanted a space outdoors for dancing. And this group of people were also predominantly female. And they were always practicing in a very secluded space inside the youth club house. And they were only out in the open when there were shows that was going to be performed. And we were kind of thinking like, why is it that, for instance, when you practice football, soccer, you can be like really bad because you're actually practicing. But for these girls who were dancing here in Roset, they only they were only seen when they were actually putting on a show. So the threshold to enter into dance practice was pretty high, and there were also this really quite. They work a lot with representation, work a lot with their bodies, and so on. But it was pretty difficult to, enter into the dance class. So we thought we should create a really nice practicing space afterwards for them. And always when we work, for us, it's very important with the aesthetic expression. And the purple color of this ball cap, that is directly taken from the dance group's color. And also one of the most important subcultural symbols of the group is this ball cap that they were using. So we thought, okay, we'll just do that. We'll make it a kind of slapstick architecture, really quick and fast. And we'll do the ball cap. And after a while working on this project, there was a big co-creative project, and the dancers were involved, but also other inhabitants of this neighborhood. So we tried to work hands-on together with everyone who is going to use it. So our main idea is that we start from a specific group with the dance group, but then of course the space that we are creating, it was for the public, it's for everyone who comes to this place. So we needed to make it sure that it would work for the community of the people who's living here. Some of the footage that passes by here, you can see how we're braiding these long braids with these young people, and they're from the nearby school. So that was a way to kind of make this place into their place as well, these young kids, so that they were part of the inauguration of it. So we were kind of decorating this place to make it come alive. And what you can do here as well is that you can via Bluetooth, you can just log on with your own media to play the music that you want to play. And you can practice here. And a lot of different groups have been using this platform. And now I want to go into a little bit of the background of how we ended up working with this cat. But I thought it was nice to show you this as a departure, since it has a lot to do with the questions that you raised in the mindful modernism, where you kind of triggered us to think about, and is how, for me, of course, this is a kind of monument. I mean, it should be in your face, it should be there and take up space. But the most important thing with this structure that we built there is how it is evolving and how it's constantly supporting the community to be a kind of playground, both for the kids, but also for the adults who live and work in this area. So it's a kind of evolving architecture in that sense. And I just, let's see. So Mipit started to work approximately 10 years ago. And we came together as a group of people who had been very engaged in theory and teaching within academia. And now I just scroll down on our webpage now to show you the cover of my PhD, which is called Behind Straight Curtains Towards a Queer Feminist Theory of Architecture. And in this, in my PhD, I was trying to see whether architecture could support queerness, to perhaps widen or give a more varied understanding of what architecture could create and what kind of lives architecture can support, and how what I name as queerness, how that can be a kind of motor for change and for finding more variation or giving more variation into the world. Because the normative world is very limiting to a lot of us. And my two colleagues, Therese and Mariana, they had been working on similar things with their students and in their different backgrounds. And I just want to see if I can show you, bring them on screen as well. So these are my two colleagues, Mariana Alves Silva and Therese Christiansson. And when we started to work together, we were kind of a bit tired of always being the ones who brought in the theories of feminism, the theories of queerness, and the more the human, and wanted to see what happens if we start to build out of these ideas. What happens if we but not just support our students to work with these ideas, material, but actually to do that ourselves. So I think our practice has been a lot about playing with these ideas and the concepts. And I'm also trying today just to stay with what we're actually doing, to give you some more views on that. So we have been working for a long time on a project that we just published last year. We published it together with an international cultural lesbian journal called Girls Like Us. And this publication, it is based on an artistic research project called The Club Scene. And in the club scene, we were revisiting important nightclubs and various kinds of clubs. But we started out with the nightclubs to see the nightclubs that were connected to a queer scene, a lesbian scene, or a feminist scene. Because one of our main ideas in this project was that we wanted to bring out how important the dance and the party is to any political movement. And we wanted to look at those spaces who are not traditionally involved in the architectural discourse, because these are spaces that are ephemeral. They might just be there for one night. On the other hand, these spaces, at least to me and my colleagues and a lot of our the pack that has joined us in the clubs, these spaces are also the spaces where you grow up, the spaces where you become yourself. And from a queer perspective, we could also say that these spaces might be the only place like home. Talking from my own experience, my biological family home was never the place where I could be myself, because I was not supposed to be the one I became to be, and or I developed to be. Whereas when I found my crowd in the clubs, in the scene, in the queer community, I started to understand who I was, and I started to be able to relate to the world from a totally different perspective. And my point is not that all these small nuclear families that I happen to come from are something bad or something like terrible. It's just that it's not for everyone to live like that. And where do you find home if that's not the home where you can develop and explore and be yourself? Well, I found my home in the clubs, in the club scenes. So in this publication, now I'm going on very long, but I just want to give you a few hints of this before we move into our discussion about that. So what we did in the club scene research is that we wanted to revisit the clubs, those ephemeral spaces. And so we recreated our fantasies about those legendary nightclubs that we wish we would have gone to. So there were our fantasies, but they're based on historical accounts, the imageries that we found, stories that people had written about them. And then we made full-scale reenactments of clubs, full with people who came, our guests. A big part of the project was to create costumes. So everyone who came to the club, the first space of the club that we created was the walk-through closet, which was a dressing room where you could change clothes. Some clubs, at some of these events, we even gave away the costumes that we'd made And there was a particular club where I remember many years afterwards, I would see people around clubbing in the costumes that we had created for this particular club. So that was kind of fun. And every club had a theme. And the most contemporary club that we tried to create was one called Sappho Island, which was based on a queer club in Kampala, Uganda, which was there for 1 year between 2010 and 2011. It was called Sappho Island. And I don't know if you know anything about the state for LGBTQI plus people in Uganda, but it's pretty harsh. And it was just amazing that the activists in Uganda were able to create this nightclub, even though it was only there, or this bar, even though it had to close after a year. But it was there and it was super important. So we tried to recreate this club in Stockholm. And at that time, there was a major conference in Stockholm by the International Lesbian and Gay Association. So we could invite all those activists that were visiting Stockholm to our club, and we mixed it with local activists in Stockholm. And then what was like the most beautiful thing was also that the activists from Uganda were also in Stockholm. So they were also part of the club that we created here. And it was a truly liminal space, because we were doing this, recreating this club in a theater in Stockholm. And we had this we had 200 people, guests, but there were actually 400 people who we wanted to have in this space. So we made it was a kind of a theatrical evening. So we had one wave of 200 people coming in, changing clothes, going into the club with all the performances, the music, and the things that we prepared, the spatial things that we prepared. And then they had to clean the space and move out. So they had to, and all this happened in 2 hours. And then came the next wave of 200 people into this very liminal space of generosity, I would say, and playing around for 2 hours and then helping us to clean it and out again. So we tried to make it a full round. And of course, for me, that's a very beautiful way of thinking about architecture and thinking about how to create spaces, like the way we activate space and the way we take care of space, even thinking about the cleaning situation. If that's the way, architecture never works without the workers of the space. So I'll end there. Now you got a little glimpse of what we are doing.
Thank you so much, Katarina, for this really inspiring, exciting, and moving subjects you presented us here. I would like to learn a bit more about your ideas. You want to show us the examples, and it was very important to see how you're working. But I would like to know a bit more about your idea of the enabling potential of architecture for forms of life. Could you elaborate a bit on this? I think this is a very important issue in both our subjects, and I would like to learn more from you about that.
Thank you. I think that's very much at the core of my interest, because I'm very much thinking about architecture as a kind of gift. You brought up the idea of the gift as well, as an act of generosity. I truly believe that if we want to change the world towards a more inclusive, like if we truly want to make a society where there's room for all of us, the best way of doing that is actually offering something or trying to act out of generosity. But we have to be, we can't just offer an empty stage. We need to put something on stage. I have a background in theater as well, so I'm always thinking about like this metaphor of the improvisation, that if you ask an actor to enter the stage and it's completely empty, there's nothing there, it's really tricky to start improvising. But as soon as you put a chair there, and if this chair is very particular, if it's the most beautiful chair that has been decorated by Vanessa Bell, for instance, you'll have so much there that you can start like working from and start to imagining the world out of. So my belief is that when we're trying as architects and designers, artists, whatever we call ourselves, to do something in the world, something material, we need to be very specific with what we do, because then that could trigger the imagination to transform reality and maybe make it more possible for more people to take space and take on space and act in public life, but also in private spaces or intimate spaces. And I have this like dilemma with the idea of the private and intimate, like a kind of dichotomy with the public and so on. And I'm thinking a lot about that when you're talking also, Beate, with about the intimate life of the Bloomsbury group, and how that kind of life was an enabler for the material life that they produced as well. And this is very much connected to your question, like actually the way we live, the way we try to like experience or our curiosity in our own lives, like how can we use that and possibly, show that there are so many more ways of living than the prescribed little square that architecture too many times is built out of. And I'm thinking I would like to sort of take this question back to you, because I have this dilemma about this. There is, I would say, quite of an insistence of the division of the private and the public, and it's kind of happening over and over and again, and I'm quite bored with it or fed up with it, because I think the private and intimate life is so fundamental for whatever we do. And as I was trying to explain also with the club project, that the public, some semi-public at least, spaces of the nightclubs, they were the places where I felt most at home, or where I still feel most at home. So what do you think about that, Beate? Do you have any take on that?
Thank you, Katarina. This is a very important aspect. And as I listen to you, I realized immediately that my presentation presents the Bloomsburys as so private people. They weren't at all, because they made all this life in these houses public by their writings, by images. Roger Fry, for example, has written a very interesting essay on the needs of modern living, and he published it, of all places, in the Vogue, 1918, just at the end of the war, after the war. I don't remember this exactly. And he said that we don't need any longer houses for representation, for representation of our status, but we need houses that fulfill our needs, our psychological, our physical, and our economical restraints. So, and they were writing and talking about their private life all the time. And I think this is a kind of political move too. Of course, it was an elitist group in a way, for sure. They were wealthy. They have to earn money by themselves too, but they're in a very privileged position. But I think to make these very unusual forms of life public was a political thing, and I think this is absolutely right. They didn't offer space for other people. That's true. They did this in their salons before and after, but this was only for a certain circle. That's right. But I think in their time it was so important to show these queer ways of living and loving and creating relationships with each other, but with the surroundings too. That is, for me, a form of of politicizing privacy. So, but I think in our time other things are needed, and so I would like to. There was one question that came up to me when you elaborated more on your ideas. The examples you have shown were all ephemeral spaces. Does this giving space works with fixed architecture too, or is it important and needed that they are fluid, ephemeral, and not stable and fixed?
Well, I mean, the ball cap, the first project that I showed just because it is actually stable. It's a pavilion, it's constructed, it's going to be there. It's made out of it's a steel structure, and the dance floor, I mean, it's built to last. And there's a really good support system also from the housing company that is backing the project. So I think it's going to be there for a while. But on the other hand, at the same time, that was not, I mean, it is important because it takes up space and it's there and it's in your face somehow. It says something. It's like, you know, we're here, you know, don't forget we're here, and we're here all the time. But at the same time, my interest actually lies in how it activates that space, how it brings people into play. And I try to visit there as often as I can. It's not in the same city where I live, but as soon as I pass, I try to visit, and I've seen the most amazing things happening there. This, I mean, just because like how I saw this elderly lady who was teaching the kids how to dance, the traditional dance from the region where she comes from, you know, and they were just putting on that music. And then one time I passed, it was those kids who wanted to be like really, I mean, do the worst thing that they could imagine. So they had put on like the, what you say, like the calling to prayer from a mosque on the loudest sound in the ball cap. And of course they knew that that would upset some people, because you can't have that in a public space in Sweden, or can you? What does that what happens? So, you know, people are playing around with that space. And there was another kind of more missionary group who was there, like, oh, let's meet at the ball cap and we're going to tell you everything about Jesus. And that wasn't planned, but happened because it's a public space and it's like activated and you can use it in many ways. And for me, that's so important. But that wouldn't happen unless it looked like it had this particular view, you know, it is this purple ball cap. And, you know, let's meet at the ball cap. Oh, and people come and meet and they do something there. So it's a kind of, for me, it's really tricky to separate the ephemeral, that which happens in the action, from materiality. And I mean, it is a long-term project, the ball cap, but maybe in 50 years it won't be there. So it's still temporary, but in 50 years, or maybe they really totally love it, so it's going to be there for 300 years. I don't know, but then they have to maintain it. So it's also one of those things I think we do in architecture. We kind of put a hierarchy between the ephemeral and the long term, and I think there's a parallel to life expectancy and life cycles and so on. How we think about, if we return to the like main frame of this webinar with the mindfulness, like, isn't that the moment when we're actually completely there? Isn't that a kind of moment of eternity somehow, even though it's only a moment? Okay. So, do you want to come back on that, or do you see how I mean?
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. So I was just thinking about private and public, and I was very intrigued by the remarks of Hannah Arendt on this topic, and she complains about the blurring between the private and the public space, but not in the way that the private has to be separated, but they have to be in another constellation, in a more offensive and visible constellation, and that each space has its own needs, and that the private is not a thing for retreat or being on your own, but it's the space where you, I forgot how she put it exactly, but it was for me very important that this blurring makes it so difficult to be to do justice to people who don't have a private space, for example. If you blur these spaces, it was a very interesting thing, and I think it's very important for rethinking this today. What does it mean? We're living together with a lot of people who don't have a private space, and so what is the consequence of this, and what is the consequence for architecture to embrace these people and to offer them a space that they can really occupy as their own? And this is a difference. I definitely understood what you said about that the club was your home, because I had the same experience with the club scene when I was young. It was really the place to express myself and to find companions. And So, but the question is, I would like to know more about your ideas of a home. What is a home?
That's a very large question. What is a home? Yeah. I mean, of course, to a certain extent, home is where the heart is. So my body is my home. But then again, I'm a very spatial person. So the spaces that surrounds me are, I'm always making them into my home, some way or the other. And I'm a very privileged person. So I actually have 2 physical homes, one in an apartment and then one in a house. So I move between those two geographies, and both of them are shared with the collective of other people. But I know I belong there, and I know I can come there and I'm welcome. And I think that idea of being welcome in a space, for me, I would say that would be the core of what I think about as a home. And when I say welcome, I'm welcome there with my full body, with all my vulnerabilities and my bad days, my anguishes, everything is welcome in those spaces. And they're not necessarily private spaces or spaces which I have solely to myself, but I have a need of course, to have that kind of space where I'm reflected my, a room of one's own. Of course, that's also part of this idea of home. But it's a tricky. It's such a huge question, and I think it's good to pose the question to ourselves and to see what. One of the things that we try to do in Mycket is that we try to involve our own bodies in our projects all the time, actually, because that's also how we kind of bring a little bit our homes into the project and create, and possibly we can create homes for other people if we truly do that, which is a risky business because you get hurt and it's a vulnerable position to actually dare your own body into the project. But unless we do that, we can't really do something for the ones who are not us. And then I think I want to extend that beyond humans as well. So how can we do that? How can we create spaces or a home that, of course, I believe that each and everyone should have a home. And how can we do that? How can we support that? What do you bring into the idea of a home, Beate?
Well, it's really a very difficult question, but I share most of the things you have said, and I'm very sensitive to space, and so I'm very much dependent on having really a space of my own that cannot be penetrated by others. So this can be a very small thing, and I have 3 homes, one in my working space, then one in my living space in Berlin, and then on the countryside in very different constellations, and I enjoy this. But in each of these things, I had a very small space that is just mine, and maybe that's a bit strange that I have this strong need for a place that can't be penetrated by others, kind of shelter thing, I don't know. And so this makes it more difficult for giving space to others if you have such a strong need. And I'm trying to think about how forms of living can be with small spaces and with rare spaces, how we can develop spaces for living that could serve this need too, without excluding others and offering them space. I don't know. It's very difficult. Yeah. And one important part for me for creating a home is being able to be a host, to invite others to come and share this space. And so this is the flip side of the of the very private space. A home that is not visited is not a home for me.
Yeah. Very interesting.
This also brings up some interesting questions. Oh, sorry, Pallavi, did you want to go?
I just wanted to say this is probably Beate and Katarina, you're talking about, at sometimes I feel, is it that you're talking about two opposite things when you're talking about home, or probably it is the same thing. It's just like the two sides of the coin. But very interesting to understand this idea of private and public, shared and intimate, that you're talking about. And this idea that, home, especially Katarina, when you talk about a home being a place, regardless, a home can be a private or a public space, but it's a place where you activate a space, where you are able to activate space. That becomes home in a sense. And Beate, probably is that how you're also looking at home, as something where you can activate a certain kind or of a form of living. This idea of activation becomes important, and then the idea of the public and private, that categorization really collapses here. It's not about whether it's public or private, but probably a space of activation. I'm not sure. I mean, those are my, when I'm listening to your fascinating conversation, those are things that come to my mind.
I think it's a very good suggestion, just to move away from this differentiation between private and public to activation, because this is much more open, and so any space could be both, and it could change its function. And this is a very intriguing idea. Thank you so much for that.
I think that's where I feel the conversation can really expand more, but other points also. And I'll let Kurt continue while I listen on to this fascinating conversation.
I thought there were some very interesting things that came up in terms of, the nature of privacy, and, how privacy has actually changed and how we consider it. Like when, Beate, when you were talking, about the Charleston house, about the idea of what would normally be kind of a private thing is kind of openly discussed in the public, or maybe a more communal manner. So the idea of what do we mean by privacy at that sense, right? And you talking about your need in, a space to have a space for yourself, right? This idea of privacy. And then Katarina, you talking about this idea of like, being private in, your parents' house, and then being open and being more public when you went to the club, this idea of, what the privacy kind of means in this publics. And, we may even look at, what's going on today in our world, where we have this sort of tendency to bring much of our kind of own personal lives out into public. We act very sort of, privately in public, with the way we talk on our phones or the way we listen to music, and kind of ignore kind of the world around us. We're in our own private world, right? We kind of create that sort of insular bubble. And this idea about, how do we actually interact? We are kind of being private in a way, but are we really kind of confronting kind of an inner privacy that, maybe is it there anymore? Is it a necessity? Is it some sort of a, highly kind of determined type of privacy? So I'm just kind of curious about this notion of maybe privacy in both of your discussions and projects, about how might we, begin to define it? What is, at an essence, a real psychological need, to have a sense of privacy, to be alone or by myself? Or is there this sort of idea that privacy could somehow open up and, engage in the communal? Any thoughts on maybe the idea of privacy?
Thank you. Yeah, I can have a little go. Yeah, because I have had this really, really horrible timing being alone. Like, I don't want to be alone, and to rather be in a group, or rather be with someone, And I was like, come on, Katarina, is this maybe just like anguish because you're afraid your fragility, or you're afraid of death? What is this? Why? So I was starting to try to find models for actually being by myself and enjoying being by myself. And I have this author that I really like, called Iacman, Swedish author. And in relation to what you bring up, Kurt, it's she about this, how we're intimate in the public with our phones and all that, and how we share everything and all that. She really talks about how we need to embrace our solitude, and almost like shade it from the rest of the world and not be so open about it, because that's where we have the ground where we can stand. And starting to think about that in that way, since a few years, I've been managing to I really need a space for myself. I really need that. So I can, it's funny because when you explain, I need this space when no one can penetrate it. It's mine. I decide here and I can invite someone, but it's my space. And I think that's precisely what Charleston Iacman writes about when she said that, we should be careful about those feelings of solitude or loneliness and so on, because that's where we have our most vulnerable and fragile space, but that's also our most creative, or our most the space of being a conscious being in the world. It lies there, and if we just flaunt it for the world with our phones and everything, we're dispersing it and we're losing ourselves. So I'm trying to think about it in that way right now. I've twisted it and say, oh, I'm feeling alone. Great. So what about it? What can I do from this space of loneliness?
Okay, Katarina, I want to tell you, that reminds me, I think it was Richard Sennett when I was probably The Fall of the Public Man, or one of his publications where he talks about women in probably the Arab countries, and when they have huge families at home, they never find their private space in there. So they actually go out into public spaces, and find a small corner where they can sit and be by themselves, and just to escape that private realm, which sometimes becomes, overbearing on them. And I thought that's the flip side, where you're escaping into the public realm to get a little bit of privacy. I found that very interesting.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's very important, Pallavi, what you said, because I think when rethinking privacy today, we have to do it in transcultural terms, and to see which are the components of what people in different cultures mean when they say privacy, and what are the means to get this privacy. And this is very interesting what you described in Arab culture, for women especially, that they're at home never alone and by themselves, and whether this idea of being by yourself is questioned as a Western idea of modern subjectivity, and I think we have to rethink that. So it's against the feeling of a real need. I think it's important to rethink that, what does this mean, being myself, and why is it so important to concentrate really on myself and not finding myself in exchange with others, or I don't know. That's for me a really interesting question, this insistence of being yourself, finding yourself, being at home, free from public view. You can find your own role. I think this is a whole, this thing doesn't work at all. So at home you are under control, and be it under the control of yourself, of your own controlling normative gaze, so your look on yourself. But so I think this is a very intriguing thing. And a colleague of mine, Wolfgang Kemp, he has written an article about interiors and painting, and just in a very he didn't elaborate on it, but he said that the etymological, the etymology of privacy means being robbed of something. And what are we being robbed of when we are private? It's very interesting. Robbed of the gaze of the others in a positive way, because the gaze of the other is part of our constitution anyhow. And so, yes, full stop.
Great, wonderful, fantastic. I also want to throw in the idea of species loneliness into this. Philosophers talk about these days, like, since humans have put themselves on top of the world, it also makes us really, really lonely somehow, because we are, we don't see how we belong into this interconnected world, and how our bodies are full of other beings. I mean, I have all these beings in my body, and everywhere. So we are, this idea of the how lonely it is on top somehow. Just to throw in another aspect of this transcultural, of the transcultural that we need to rethink.
there's a wonderful essay by Tim Ingold. It's about dwelling. And he describes the idea of dwelling with an example of a tree and all the animals who inhabit this tree, and how they are interwoven with each other. And it's against this idea that only human beings are engineers and they are building, and other creatures just don't build, they just fulfill their needs. And this is a really very interesting essay about how a surrounding is lived, is just built by living, and not by an idea, but by practices. And so there's one question that came up at your first sentences, Katarina, and if you don't mind, I would like to switch a bit. It's about you said that for you and your team, it's very important that you're crafting. And I like this, and I would like to learn more about the importance of crafting in your general idea of giving architecture this potential of giving space to others. What is the role of crafting in your perspective?
Mm-hmm. There are several important aspects of crafting. I mean, one of them is of course a kind of joy in the making, that you're actually doing with your own hands. But it also actually connects to what we just talked about with this the idea of the transcultural, because I've also realized that it's a great way to meet across cultures via crafting. A lot of times we do working with a method we call DIG, doing in group, rather than DIY. And in this DIG, we are always crafting in large groups of people. And we created several projects like that. And an important thing is that we kind of invent some kind of craft that we can share with a group of people. And each and everyone who is involved should be able to, with their own skills and their own joys and desires for what they want to create, come into the project, and what they create in the project should be seen through their craft. But as a group, we should also create something that is a totality, somehow, a piece, a joint piece, a shared piece. And what's fantastic in this project, for instance, we made, just to give an example, because I understand this becomes very abstract, but we made, for instance, a redecoration. We repainted a little house in close to where we built the ball cap, and this house was really like sad, and it was supposed to be a stage, but it just didn't look like a stage. It wasn't the festive space that you wanted for a celebration. So we thought, okay, let's repaint this. And each and everyone who came to this workshop and repainted and redecorated that shed, they added their own parts with their hands, of course. And we had some, and of course, we made a kind of total picture for the shed or this dance box, stage box. But you could also see each and everyone's of the participants' hand in the making. So, and I think it became a beautiful pattern. I think Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant would have liked it. You know, it's this kind of hands-on modernity. We just do it and we transform the world by doing it together as a collective. But you could also go into each part and say, that part was actually decorated by Hannah, and Achim was over there, and but so so that's it. But then we also, when we start to build, I mean, there's so many aspects of crafting. Someone was like hesitating where to go into, but at one point we started to call ourselves like craft-detects, like we're crafting. Like, is it what would that mean for the profession if architects were actually crafting the buildings? And we have only a tiny building, but we have crafted a clay building just to see what to start exploring the means of clay building, which is a very like heavy crafting to do, because clay is a heavy material, but it's a wonderful material, and like the majority of the world's population live in clay buildings. So, you know, it's something we need to explore. So we're crafting it with our own hands. But then, of course, if it needs to be multiplied, we might have to find another means of doing it. But it's then in that case, the crafting is a way for us to explore a material, to understand it more. And yeah, so just a few examples of how I think about crafting.
Yeah, thank you, because it was resonating with some ideas on the Bloomsbury group, because for them crafting is so important too. And Roger Fry, he's very dry in theory. I don't like his theories, but I like him as a practitioner. And he was so interested in doing things, and he did pottery, and he did painting, and he did exhibitions with children and all these things. And he was always talking about spirituality, and he always rejects to give a definition what it means. And it was definitely not in religious terms. And lately I wrote a text by Amanda Kumaraswamy. I hope I pronounce it correctly, Pallavi. So, and he was writing about the Indian craftsman, and craftsmanship is more important than art, because in crafting, the joy, and you said joy too, the joy of the making is in a way, it stays in the material and in the form, and it's communicating with the viewer and the user of these things. And I really love this idea. I was wondering whether Fry know the text by Kumaraswamy, because they were both in the US for some time. So, and I'm really very much into this question, this aspect, the communicative aspect of crafting. And you put it in another way too, of doing this together and showing of the doing together. And this is something that intrigues me with the Bloomsbury group, because they do this too, this showing of making together as a form of artistic expression that is not the individual, that is not a solidist genius or something like this, but it's really the making and finding a form that's communicative in this way too. To have this joy of doing it and of doing it together, and let the material live in a way without fetishizing this thing. But I think there is something about this too.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it has so much to do also with the idea that you brought up about like how the Bloomsbury group, how they like animated and inhabited the spaces. You said something about, you know, like you put those two words together, and I think that's so beautiful. Like, how do you like the animation of space? I think that's really, really triggering to me to think about. And now what you talk about, like with the crafting, that is truly a way to animate a space, because you bring out the spirit of the space. So, and of course the animate is also connected to spirituality. So
there's an interesting movement that I've noticed in the last little while, especially like, you know, being an educator, we talk to students all the time and see what they're up to. This identification with maker spaces, as they're called, where you would have, you know, the ability to create something digital and then have it printed three-dimensionally. And so there's that sort of craft element, but there's this sort of digital buffer, this intermediary of the digital, which kind of negates that sort of hands-on approach. So could you maybe talk, Katarina and Beate, about that idea of crafting, but maybe in a digital realm? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Does it open up possibilities? Does it restrict it? What would be your understanding on that?
I'm the opposite of a digital nerd. So, and I always believe there are opportunities. I'm not a pessimist. And I made an interesting experience with in a student's project, and it was a way to design a game to approach art history. And they should design an appropriate room for one art piece that they should choose themselves. And I thought they will do it in a digital way. But they came with little boxes where they built surroundings for pictures, for sculptures, and I was really smashed. It was so beautiful. So, and the potential of the digital, maybe Katarina, you know more about this. I believe it, but I can't say why and how it should come out. I don't know.
I mean, of course, there is a great potential in it, but for me, I think what's really so interesting is to move back and forth between different ways of working in like hands-on material. I mean, for instance, with the clay, but then in the next step, I would film it and make an animation, and then I could, you know, since we talked a little bit about animating spaces, and that would, like the project I'm working on right now, the project called Troll Perceptions in the Heartlands, we're working on that idea of like it's a little bit like you can bring out the things. Okay, so I make something with my hands, and then I film it and I make an animation with it. And I can bring out something that I want to show and share with someone else via the animation. So in that sense, the digital animation would help me to explore what it is that I have created. And then I would say, okay, so now maybe this is like a little set design for my animation. So what happens, okay, in this animation, something happens and then the story unfolds, and oh, I need to build something more because the story unfolded, and then I continue to craft something with my hands or with the help of others, like building something. So yeah, I would say, so the great thing about it is that we have all these means, these tools, and it would be really terrible to say that, oh, no, we can't use that, we shouldn't use this, and we should just say like, okay, so we have this variation, but it's not a default to walk into the digital world, or not a default to, I guess for me, maybe default to go into the material, actually, as a starting point, I would say. But I would move between various formats.
I have to look for some light. I'm not at home.
Oh yeah, you're getting darker and darker.
Yeah, it's getting evening here. Sorry.
But also, I mean, I could say something a bit more about animation, because I think that also has a really nice and interesting relationship to all the things that we perceive as stable as architecture. We perceive it's stable and it's permanent, and you have all this, but then you make it into an animation and suddenly you realize, oh, welcome back, Beate. You realize that it's the walls are moving. And all walls are moving. They just pretend to be stable and permanent and there forever. But you can open a door, or you can, you know, paint it, and then it will have a totally different meaning, or decorate it in some other ways. Just like what the Bloomsbury did. And suddenly the wall means something else, and it can give support to another person or another group of people or others.
I think there's also something very interesting about the ephemeral, you know, when you talked about, you know, these types of spaces that could be created, you know, for events, right? The sense that something is set up. And, you know, when we think about maybe the modern trajectory, you know, this idea about building, you know, these highly curated spaces that, you know, are meant to endure and have this sense of continuance, the ephemeral kind of is a denial of that sort of, you know, extension, you know, through time. And this idea of maybe kind of creating moments, you know, or creating spaces, right? This type of, you know, interior type of environment that will facilitate a particular type of engagement experience and things like that, that will exist, you know, with the participants and kind of resonate with them, you know, after the space has been dismantled or, you know, has dissolved or has gone away. So where would you, either of you, and I see there's, you know, this in the Charleston house, this sort of sense that the interiors were these spaces for, you know, experimentation, for creation, you know, to try, you know, and create these new types of experiences, not something that's thought ahead of time and then executed and is stable and never changes, but something that evolves. Where would your understanding of this sort of, you know, ephemeral or temporalness stand in relationship to the larger sort of modernist, you know, kind of highly crafted, highly curated, highly sort of enduring, you know, type of expression of architecture and interior spaces?
Well, it's, I still don't have an answer for this. It's but I think it's a good starting point to rethink modernism. What does this fluidity, or this fluidity is maybe the the best word for this. What does this mean for our notion of modernity, or what other notions come in? What is put aside in a way? And for sure, brutalist fantasies about big architecture, they are not at stake at the moment. That's quite sure. But what this means for creation, for spatial, for invention of spaces, and I'm not quite sure at the moment. Katarina, what do you think? You're working with ephemeral and fluid spaces all the time.
Yeah, maybe, Kurt, maybe you could, do you have like a great example of the kind of building you're referring to, which is doing that?
I thought it was very interesting when you were showing that video right at the beginning about, the kids, twining the, the cloth and things like that. And it was set in this sort of, you had this sort of drone video of the landscape, which was this, a lot of modernist buildings in the background, which once established kind of don't change. They just kind of deteriorate or something like that, but they don't kind of evolve and adapt. And where, I think your approach in like creating, the CAP pavilion was a stage for these types of interactions, of moments of people coming together, interacting, generating some sort of, a significance through an experience, that will generate meaning and memories and things like that. And then it would disappear, but there's always this kind of like stage that this would happen. But, sometimes we would have these examples of, how we might conceive of a building, a house or something like that, that endures in kind of a stable type of format. It doesn't change. I think about like a, Corbusier house or a Mies van der Rohe building or something like that. Once it's set, you don't mess with it. It's kind of iconic. It's just kind of, is what it is. And it's kind of this frozen moment that endures where, when I look at, Charleston House and I look at what, you're doing, Katarina, there is this sort of, ephemerality, there's this sort of openness to change, this sort of interaction, about as people evolve, develop, think, and things like that. It's reflected in the environment. The environment is either somehow participant or reflective, kind of it becomes imprinted upon, with this type of engagement. So I'm just kind of curious if, that sort of an understanding, because, we're coming out of this sort of, we're talking about modernism in this sort of larger sense. And, there is this sort of denial in both of your guys' approach to talking about, the liminal spaces, these sorts of, spaces of transition that is kind of counter to that larger sort of, modern narrative. So I'm just kind of curious, in your thinking from maybe a historical point of view or from an action point of view of being out there and engaging, how much of that are you aware, or is it just organic? I'm just kind of, I'd like to know. I don't know if there's an answer like, Beate is talking about, but I think it's topic for discussion.
Yeah, no, I think that was a great way of now I understand more what you're asking, so that this is a big discussion and it's really, really interesting. I need to bring in another favorite architect of mine, Eileen Gray, and her like iconic building E1027 on the French Riviera, where she actually was trying to create a living organism. That was what she was trying to create. Like that little building should be an organisme vivant. That's so cool. I mean, how do you do that as an architect? And it's not. I mean, it is stable, and now it's been renovated, so it's back to, or they tried to renovate it back to what she once created. But what she did there was that she had all these little ways where a wall could move or a wall could disappear. And one of the main walls towards the Mediterranean Sea is made like what you call accordion. So you can pull it aside. And so when it's pulled aside, actually that entire space become a terrace. It's a roof covered terrace, but it becomes a terrace. So suddenly that space is it's another space. And there are other things that she did, which were like really corny and queer, like a window, how it usually opens, but her windows, they pivot on the middle. So it's not, you open a window, but it's, so, or there is a cupboard built into a corner. And it's the same thing there. You don't open a drawer like that, but actually it pivots out from the corner. So suddenly that corner isn't a corner anymore. So she kind of do all these things that makes the building become something else than what it was appeared to be at the first glance. So it's a way of playing with the stability of an iconic building. And what I find so fascinating about that architecture is that it's actually the social, it's a social space because it's transformed via bodies who change it, and what these bodies are doing together in the space. And because of that, the space is transformed. So that little building managed to be both super iconic and a living organism, I would say.
That sounds fantastic.
That's very interesting. There's a question for you in the chat, Beate, especially. I think you mentioned a book earlier on when we started our conversation. And Jennifer from the audience is asking if you could talk, or you could tell her who the writer was, where you're talking about houses that fulfill our needs, both physical and psychological.
It was Roger Fry. It's an essay. It was published in the Vogue, in the international, in the British Vogue, 1918, and it's reprinted in one of the books Christopher Reed edited. I think it's either in Roger Fry Vision and Design or in a book collected his writings. I don't know exactly, but if Jennifer would like to leave her email, I can send her a scan of this.
That would be very helpful. So Jennifer, if you can pass your email to me, I will pass it on to Beate.
But it would take 5 weeks to send it, because normally I don't have WLAN here, and this is the last minute of WLAN.
Definitely. Beate, you're traveling, so that's understandable.
No, that's so generous of you, Beate.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you. If the audience has any questions or comments, please put in the chat, and Kurt, I will let you take it from here. You're muted.
Just when you think you have control over everything. I just wanted to say the discussion has been great so far, but I was going to ask if anybody in the audience had any questions as we move towards wrapping up this session. And maybe, while we're waiting for questions, I might just ask Beate and Katarina if you have any sort of closing remarks on, the session topic and the discussion that we had today. Beate, would you like to start?
Well, I'm curious how your students will come up with new ideas about organic housings and places to share and new forms of privacy, because your students are the ones who are the future architects of our private life too. So and I want to thank you for this really inspiring conversation.
Thank you. Katarina?
Yeah, thank you so much for this conversation and this discussion. I've been completely immersed. So when you asked me about final remarks, I was like, what? Oh yeah, maybe I should do that as well. But so I'm just going to copy Beate, because that's so interesting, because that's what I'm sitting here and wanting, like, the participants, where are they? Because we can only see the 4 of us, of course, on the screen. And yeah, I would have loved to meet you all who are there, and I hope we raised some curiosity. And please, if we did, and if there's something you want to ask afterwards, you can contact me via Mycket and so on, and I'll just try to reply. Hopefully, we put some, I don't know, we throw some seeds out that might be interesting to keep on working with. And Beate, it was so great to talk to you. It's also nice that we haven't planned the discussion, just happens, and then we'll see how it evolves. And thank you all so much, Kurt and Pallavi. It's been really, really great to meet you. And I really hope we will meet again.
Us too. And we have to thank you, for agreeing to participate, because taking time out of both of your busy schedules to do this has just been amazing. And our agenda, in the larger sort of academic initiatives that we work with the Center for Mindful Habitats, is to have these webinars as a way to generate discussion, to get new ideas, new possibilities, new ways of thinking out into the open. And our next goal is to get back get information back into the classroom. So, as Pallavi and I are both educators, we have a strong interest in, curating and cultivating the next, generation of designers who are coming up, and give them new ways of thinking. And, we're both firm believers in this sort of critical approach to, a mindful awareness, not necessarily just, in a meditative and kind of, relaxation process, but to actually apply that sort of critical inquiry into design thinking and design practice. And so we're also, setting up seminars and courses and things like that, where we will be taking the information we get from these sessions and introducing it to the students. And of course, there's always opportunities to participate in those. And of course, we'll be sending, in the invitations and, updates on that as well. And I also wanted to reach out to the audience to say that, if this is something that is of interest to you in participating in the webinars and, what we're doing in academic initiatives or in the studio, and we're also, putting together publications, right? So we also want to be able to, spread, the information and the ideas that we're generating here to, again, a much wider audience. And if anybody is, interested in participating, collaborating, or just, getting involved, just send us an email, because we would very much like, to continue these series and, continue our investigations and continue to get, new ways of thinking out into the world. And that's kind of what we're doing here, with our initiative. So your participation in this has just been wonderful to bring different new ways of thinking apart from, the standard stuff you might find in the textbook and classroom. This is opening up, wonderful ideas, not just for us, but for the students, about what we could possibly do. How could we, work in a much more sort of interdisciplinary way? And so, we've been finding these sessions to be very stimulating and very engaging. And of course, we'd love to have more participation as well. And again, thank you so much for taking time to join us today. Pallavi, do you have anything you would want to add?
I just want to thank Beate and Katarina, and also everyone who's watching this. I think the conversations that have been generated in the series, each of them took its own direction and also helped us inform this idea of mindfulness and design. So we are very thankful for all your inputs. And I think this conversation we might end for today, but it's not ending. And I hope we will continue to have this conversation in different ways, through different initiatives that we are planning. So yeah, we'll be in touch. Anyone in the audience, as Kurt said, can reach out to either of us. And Roger is not here. I also want to thank Roger. He's been very, very instrumental in putting this together. So I want to thank Roger and probably close for the day.
Yeah, I guess this will bring our session to a conclusion. I don't see any other questions in the chat. So again, I would just like to thank Beate and Katarina for a wonderful session and wonderful discussion today. It's been great meeting you and listening to you to hear what you had to say. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. So that will conclude today's session. Thanks for everyone for joining today and for participating in the Mindful Modernisms webinar. This is the end of our series, and thank you so much. Stay tuned. We will be announcing our next webinar series sometime in the summer, I hope, Pallavi. And we'll let you know exactly what the next webinar series will be about. So stay tuned. So thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend and take care. Bye.
Bye now.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
I will send you the text right now, and you can try to find it, and then you can forward it to Jennifer.